Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you.
Charlotte stepped out of the car, her shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. The long-abandoned estate loomed before her, its weathered stone facade dappled with the shadows of bare branches. A late autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint, musty scent of decay. This place had a story, an ugly one, though her family rarely spoke of it. Even as a child, whenever she'd asked about her uncle's home, her mother's response was always the same, a shake of the head and a change of subject. Now it belonged to her. She adjusted the strap of her bag, hesitating at the edge of the cracked front steps. The windows stared back at her, dark and uninviting. Her uncle had lived here alone until his recent, unexplained death. The executor's letter said she was the last living heir, and the estate had passed to her. She'd debated coming at all. After all, what was there for her here but rotting wood and bad memories? Yet something had pulled her toward it. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps something deeper. As she took the first step onto the porch, a strange sensation washed over her, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if the house itself was aware of her presence. The boards creaked beneath her feet, their groans unsettling in the quiet. She took a deep breath and tried the door. To her surprise, it opened easily. Inside, the air was heavy, laden with the smell of mildew and old wood. Dust motes swirled in the pale light, streaming through the grimy windows. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, their intricate carvings dulled by grime. At one point, this home had been grand. A sweeping staircase curved up toward a second-floor landing, and an enormous chandelier hung in the entryway, its crystals dull and cobwebbed. As she stepped further in, a faint sound reached her ears. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. A whisper, too soft to make out the words, but undeniably there. Her heart quickened. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering. There was no answer, just the faint murmuring that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She turned toward the sound, her feet carrying her deeper into the house. Her uncle had died here, she thought. They'd found him slumped in his study, but the cause of death had been inconclusive. She wondered if that study was where the whispers were coming from. A narrow hallway stretched ahead of her, lined with doors that looked warped and swollen from years of neglect. Her footsteps echoed softly, and she couldn't help but feel that she was being watched. She stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the end of the hall, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. Just as she was about to turn it, a sudden thud from upstairs made her jump. She spun around, staring up at the shadowed landing. "Is someone there?" she called again. Her voice was firmer this time, but the only response was the creaking of the floor above her, as if something was moving. Charlotte hesitated, the urge to run growing stronger, but something rooted her in place. Maybe it was her own stubbornness, or maybe it was the strange, almost magnetic pull of this house. She couldn't leave. Not yet. "Hello?" she tried once more. The whispering grew louder, though still incomprehensible. Her hand, almost without her consent, turned the knob of the door in front of her. The old wood groaned as it swung open. Inside was a sitting room, lined with faded furniture covered in white sheets. On a side table sat a small framed photograph. She stepped closer, brushing away the layer of dust. It was a picture of her uncle, smiling warmly. Behind him, just out of focus, stood a figure in black. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. The whisper faded then, as if the house was satisfied that she had seen what it wanted her to see. Charlotte placed the photo back on the table, her hands trembling. Whatever this place was, it wasn't going to give up its secrets easily. She turned toward the door, glancing back over her shoulder. She couldn't be sure, but she thought the photograph had changed. Her uncle's smile looked strained now, and the figure behind him seemed closer. Charlotte didn't sleep that first night. Instead, she sat in the dim glow of a single bulb above the kitchen table, her fingers brushing the cracked leather cover of the journal she'd found. The night had grown unnervingly quiet. No creaking boards, no faint whispers, just a suffocating silence that pressed against her ears. The journal was old, its spine loose, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic. She'd found it hidden under a broken floorboard in what must have been her uncle's study. The space had been in shambles, books toppled from shelves, papers strewn across the floor as if someone or something had searched frantically for something. Amid the mess, the journal had almost gone unnoticed, but now, sitting in the stillness, Charlotte couldn't ignore it. With a shaky breath, she opened to the first page. The writing was her uncle's. She recognized his peculiar slanted script from the few letters he'd sent her family years ago. The entries began normally enough, detailing repairs to the estate and notes about the land's upkeep. But after a few pages, the tone shifted. "I hear them at night," one entry read. "Soft whispers that seem to drift from the walls. I thought it was the wind at first, but it's not. It's never the same. They say my name now. Every night they call to me." Charlotte felt a prickle of unease as she continued. Her uncle wrote of sleepless nights spent pacing the halls, chasing sounds that led nowhere. He described how certain doors refused to stay closed, how objects moved when he wasn't looking. The chandelier in the entryway swayed when the air was still. The fireplace roared to life on its own, then snuffed out just as quickly. The entries grew more frantic. Our uncle stopped writing about routine repairs and began chronicling his attempts to understand what was happening. He researched the history of the estate, seeking clues about the original owners. He wrote about the woman in the portrait above the staircase, how he sometimes caught her expression changing, how her eyes seemed to follow him. "Last night, I saw her," one entry read, the ink smudged as if his hand had trembled. Not just the painting. Her. She was in the hallway, just standing there. I turned on the light and she was gone. But I know it was her. The same face. She's not bound to the frame anymore. Charlotte turned the page, and her breath caught. The handwriting had become jagged, almost illegible. He described shadows that moved without light, shapes that appeared at the edge of his vision and vanished when he turned his head. He spoke of a strange, rhythmic tapping that followed him from room to room. The journal's later entries were nearly incoherent, full of half-finished sentences and scribbled-out words. One of the final entries stood out. It was clearer than the rest, as if her uncle had mustered all his strength to write it. "I found the door. I sealed it. I thought that would stop them, but I was wrong. I hear them still. The barrier is weakening. It's found me. There's no running now." Charlotte stared at the page, her hands clammy. She flipped to the very last entry, but it wasn't words. It was a series of symbols, strange, looping shapes that resembled eyes and twisting roots. She didn't recognize them, but they made her stomach churn just looking at them. The ink seemed to shimmer slightly under the light. What door had he sealed? And what had he tried to keep out? Charlotte's gaze flicked to the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding. The house was utterly silent, but the silence felt watchful, as though it was waiting. She closed the journal, her pulse thudding in her ears. If her uncle's writings were to be believed, and she had no reason to doubt them now, this house was more than just a decrepit estate. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. By morning, the oppressive silence of the night seemed almost like a bad dream. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, and the house's sagging floors and peeling wallpaper looked almost benign in the gentle light. Charlotte decided to spend the day trying to make sense of what she'd read, to convince herself that her uncle's increasingly frantic journal entries were nothing more than the writings of a lonely man in decline. But then there was the door. It had stood out to her since the moment she arrived. At the far end of the hallway on the second floor, a door stood slightly apart from the others. Its wood was darker, older, and the brass knob was polished as though it had been handled often. But when she'd tried to open it last night, it wouldn't budge. not locked, just sealed in a way that felt unnatural. Her uncle had written about a door he'd sealed. Could this be it? Charlotte approached it again that morning, curiosity outweighing her unease. The air seemed colder the closer she got, and as her fingers brushed the knob, she felt a faint vibration. It was as if something was alive behind the wood. She pulled at the handle, but again, it didn't give. She tried pressing her shoulder against the door and pushing, but the frame didn't so much as creak. Whatever held it shut wasn't physical, or at least, not something she could force. Finally, she sat down in front of it, her back resting against the opposite wall. What could her uncle have meant? The journal was vague, and she didn't have a key or any clear instructions. Had he sealed this door to keep something in, or to keep himself out? As the day wore on, Charlotte began to notice small, unsettling details. The air near the door felt heavier than the rest of the house, making it harder to breathe. And every now and then she thought she heard a faint tapping, just a single knock, so soft she couldn't be certain if it was real. She pressed her ear to the door, but the sound stopped immediately, leaving her feeling both foolish and frightened. A locked room haunted her thoughts as she explored the rest of the house. She wandered through dusty bedrooms, a library filled with rotting books, and a crumbling solarium overtaken by vines. But no matter how far she roamed, her mind kept returning to that door. The tapping, the cold air, the feeling that she wasn't supposed to open it, but also the nagging urge that maybe she should. That evening, after a meager meal of canned soup and crackers, Charlotte returned to the second floor. She stared at the door from the hallway's end, her nerves fraying. It wasn't just a door anymore. It felt like a presence, as if it was aware of her, just as she was of it. Before she could stop herself, she approached it again. She placed both hands on the knob, twisting with all her strength. The effort was futile. The door refused to move. She crouched down, inspecting the edges for any sign of what might be holding it shut. Was it nailed from the other side? A lock she couldn't see? Then she noticed it. Faint symbols etched into the wood near the top corner. They looked similar to the ones she'd seen at the end of her uncle's journal. The looping shapes, the almost eye-like curves. They weren't obvious. The grime and age of the door had hidden them well. But now that she'd spotted them, she couldn't unsee them. They seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as if they held their own source of illumination. Chill ran down her spine. Her uncle must have carved them. But what were they? Protective wards? Warnings? Or something else entirely? Charlotte hesitated, then whispered aloud, "What are you hiding?" The air seemed to shift. It wasn't a breeze, but rather a pressure that pressed against her chest. The faint tapping resumed, louder this time. Her heart raced as she stumbled back from the door, nearly tripping over herself. The tapping became more insistent. 4, 5, 6 rapid knocks, then silence. She stared at the door. The next morning, Charlotte found herself drawn to the grand staircase again. She hadn't been able to shake the events of the previous day. The locked room, the strange markings, the tapping. It had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Perhaps that was why she avoided the second floor for now, sticking to the first level of the house. She decided to spend the day cataloging what her uncle had left behind. Furniture, books, scattered keepsakes that might give her more insight into the man he'd been and the house's troubling history. But as she worked, her eyes kept returning to the portrait above the staircase. It was the largest painting in the house, positioned right at the top of the stairs so that anyone ascending would be greeted by it. The woman in the portrait was dressed in Victorian-era finery, her gown dark and richly textured, the details rendered so meticulously that the fabric almost seemed real. Her skin was pale, her features sharp, and her expression unreadable. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown, but something in between. Her eyes were the most unsettling part. They were a piercing blue, painted with such precision that they seemed to glint in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. At first, Charlotte tried to ignore it, but she couldn't. Every time she passed by, those eyes seemed to follow her, lingering just long enough. that she questioned whether it was her imagination. By late afternoon, she decided to examine the painting more closely. Perhaps it was just the artistry, something in the technique that made the subject's gaze appear lifelike. She stood on the landing, staring up at the portrait. The woman's dark hair was piled high, an elaborate style that suggested wealth and status. The background of the painting was nondescript, just a shadowy void that made the figure seem even more stark. "Who are you?" Charlotte murmured, half to herself. The air around her felt thick. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that she stood still, the space seemed heavier, almost suffocating. She reached out, fingers just brushing the edge of the gilded frame. Her hand recoiled almost immediately. The metal was ice cold, far colder than the surrounding air. She frowned, rubbing her fingertips together as she stepped back. And then she saw it. And then she saw it. The woman's head had shifted. It was so subtle, she almost didn't believe it. Her body remained perfectly still, poised, elegant, but her head was tilted just slightly, her chin now angled toward Charlotte. The eyes that had once seemed to glance past her now stared directly into hers. Charlotte stumbled back, nearly tripping on the edge of the stair. Her breath caught in her throat, and her vision swam. No, it wasn't possible. The painting hadn't changed. It couldn't have. Oh, when she dared to look again, it was clear. The woman's posture, her clothing, everything was the same, but her gaze was different, unrelenting, unmoving. Charlotte backed away, descending the staircase one step at a time, unable to tear her eyes from the portrait. Her stomach churned. This house, she thought. This house is playing with me. She reached the bottom step and spun around, heading for the parlor. She needed space, needed to think. But as she fled the landing, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a soft, dry rustling, like fabric shifting, like silk brushing against silk. Her heart thumped wildly. Slowly, against her better judgment, she turned to look back up at the portrait. The woman's head had returned to its original position, straightforward, elegant, and composed. Charlotte stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours, her hands clenched into fists, her breathing shallow and uneven. Finally, she forced herself to step away. She didn't look back again. She couldn't. But no matter how many steps she took, she felt the weight of the woman's stare pressing into her back. That night, sleep evaded Charlotte once again. She lay in the dusty bed in what used to be the master bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling as the events of the past few days replayed in her mind. The journal, the locked room, the portrait, it all gnawed at her, made the very air feel heavier, harder to breathe. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman's face, those piercing eyes, that almost smile. She turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but it did no good. She was too on edge, too aware of how quiet the house was. The thought crossed her mind more than once. She should leave. Just pack a bag, drive back to the city, and deal with the estate later. But every time she considered it, something held her back. What if leaving didn't change anything? What if it followed her? As she stared at the clock on the nightstand, its glowing numbers shifting to 2:17 a.m., the silence was broken. The phone rang. Charlotte bolted upright. The sound was so jarring, so unexpected, that it sent a shock of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She hadn't even thought the phone worked. It was a relic, an old rotary model covered in dust, perched on a side table in the parlor. She'd ignored it until now, assuming it was nothing more than a decoration. Yet here it was, ringing loudly, cutting through the stillness. She didn't move at first, just stared out into the darkness as the rings continued. Finally, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold, wooden floor. The ringing seemed impossibly loud now, each chime digging into her nerves. She told herself it was probably nothing, some random connection finally sparking to life, after years of disuse. That was all. She just needed to pick it up, prove to herself that no one would be there, and go back to bed. The house creaked under her weight as she walked down the hall and descended the stairs. The parlor was pitch dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The phone continued to ring, unrelenting, a hollow, old-fashioned sound that echoed unnaturally in the cavernous space. Charlotte approached it slowly. The brass rotary dial glinted faintly in the dim light. She could see her reflection in the metal, small, pale, tense. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and lifted the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice came out more like a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing, just faint static, soft and distant. Then, slowly, a voice emerged. "Charlotte." "Welcome to the sign. Thank you for listening. Keep up the good work. Take care of yourself or your family. Always seek your guidance and comfort. Walks you through the job opportunities ahead of you. Please never bore them. They need time off intensity. They need energy to continue to grow. Find a song that continues to draw you in. Help keep you safe. More information, don't tell me what to do. Get emergency capital and get facts. This is the best way to prevent death. We don't need to come from the corner, we just need to come to be safe. Someone's life. Families are not born killer. Individuals, team members are prone to taking life chances. We roll with life. The pride we appreciate and genuine support comes from the pride we possess after departing from cells. Our next connecting force would be the public. There are no politicians in this country who will be prize-lynching hospitals, causing self-induced apologists to be tracking and see the tree anyways. In fact, this will produce deaths doubles. It was faint, crackling, but unmistakable. Someone had said her name. Her hand tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice breaking slightly. "What do you want?" Static again. Then, after a long pause, the same voice replied. It was slow, deliberate, and oddly familiar. "You shouldn't have come here." Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard it was almost painful. She felt frozen, unable to move, unable to hang up. The voice wasn't one she recognized, yet there was something about it that sent a shiver down her spine. It was calm, but the calmness made it all the more unnerving. Like the person, or whatever it was, knew something she didn't. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" More static. The line crackled faintly, and she thought she heard something in the background, like the faintest hint of a laugh. Then the voice spoke again, more forcefully this time. "Leave, before it's too late." A sharp click, and the line went dead. Charlotte stood there, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. Slowly, she placed the phone back on its cradle. She turned and scanned the dark parlor, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching her. But the room was empty. Her legs felt weak as she made her way back to the staircase. The creak of each step seemed impossibly loud. When she reached the bedroom, she didn't even bother turning on the light. She just crawled back under the blanket, curling up tightly, staring at the clock until morning. The phone didn't ring again that night, but the voice lingered in her mind, repeating those words over and over. "You shouldn't have come here." Charlotte woke the next morning feeling as though she hadn't slept at all. The faint traces of daylight seeped through the cracks in the bedroom's tattered curtains, but it brought no comfort. The events of the previous night, the phone call, the voice played in her mind on an endless loop. She wanted to tell herself it had been a dream or a stress-induced hallucination, but it felt far too real. The words echoed in her head, "Leave, before it's too late." Despite her exhaustion, she forced herself to keep moving. She spent the morning cleaning what she could, mostly to distract herself. She worked on the lower floor, sorting through her uncle's belongings. though she couldn't stop glancing toward the staircase, half expecting something to come down it. She'd meant to explore the second floor again, but her legs felt rooted every time she got close. The locked door haunted her thoughts, as did the portrait's eyes. Still, she reasoned that if she kept busy, maybe the day would pass quietly. Maybe she'd regain some sense of normalcy. By early afternoon, the house was eerily quiet, too quiet. The type of silence that seemed to amplify every small sound. The creak of old wood under her feet was louder. The faint whistle of wind outside was more noticeable. And then gradually, another sound emerged. A sound that made her skin crawl. Footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible at first. A single creak above her, as if someone had shifted their weight. Then another. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, crossing the ceiling above her head. Charlotte froze, her heart pounding. She strained to listen, telling herself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat that had found its way into the attic. But these footsteps were too heavy, too human. She set down the stack of old books she'd been sorting and stood motionless, staring up at the ceiling. The steps continued, moving down the length of the upstairs hallway. She followed the sound with her eyes, tracking its progress from above the study to above the library. Then, it stopped. Charlotte held her breath, waiting, but the silence returned. Her body remained tense, her pulse racing. She told herself she was being irrational. This house was old. Old houses made noises, didn't they? She clung to that thought, to any explanation that didn't involve someone or something lurking just out of sight. But the quiet didn't last. The footsteps resumed, but this time they were closer, coming down the stairs. A wave of cold fear washed over her. Each step sounded deliberate, unhurried, as if whoever or whatever was descending wasn't in any rush. Charlotte couldn't move. Her gaze locked on the staircase at the end of the hallway. Her muscles frozen, her breath shallow. The sound grew louder. The creak of old wood beneath each footstep. Closer and closer. When the footsteps reached the bottom step, the sound stopped. Charlotte waited, her throat dry, her hands trembling. She stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, staring at the staircase, expecting someone to appear, but no one did. The hallway was empty. Finally summoning what little courage she had, she stepped toward the stairs. Each movement felt agonizingly slow. When she reached the base of the staircase, she peered upward. The second floor was silent, the dim light casting long shadows. No sign of anyone, no creak of movement, nothing. She took one step up the staircase, then another. Her hand gripped the railing so tightly it hurt. As she climbed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. When she reached the landing, she hesitated. The locked door was still there, and the woman's portrait hung in its usual place. Everything appeared untouched. Then she noticed the wet footprints. They trailed from the top of the stairs down the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Small puddles marked each step, leading directly to the locked door. The prints were too large to belong to any animal. They were human and fresh, as if someone or something had walked through water just moments before. Her stomach twisted. Her uncle's journal had mentioned wet footprints once, hadn't it? She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it was impossible to ignore. She followed the trail with her eyes, dreading what she might find in the end. But the trail stopped at the locked door. It didn't go past it, just ended abruptly, as if whatever had made the prints had gone no farther. Charlotte's breath caught as she heard a faint rhythmic tapping from the other side of the door. Her blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, unable to tear her eyes from that sealed room. The tapping grew louder for a moment, then stopped entirely, leaving the house in suffocating silence. She turned and rushed down the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. Back in the parlor, she grabbed her coat and keys, ready to leave. She'd had enough. The journal, the painting, the phone call, the footsteps. This house was wrong. She needed to get out before whatever was behind that door came looking for her. But as she reached the front door, a heavy, oppressive sensation washed over her. The thought of leaving felt impossible. It wasn't just fear, there was something deeper, something that held her in place. She turned the doorknob, but her hand refused to push it open. Tomorrow, she told herself, though she didn't believe it. I'll leave tomorrow, but deep down she knew the house wouldn't let her go so easily. Charlotte spent most of the following day wandering the house. Though wandering might not have been the right word. She was searching, compelled by something she didn't fully understand. It wasn't curiosity anymore. She didn't want to know more about the house's mysteries, but there was a pull, a magnetism she couldn't resist, guiding her through its endless halls and rooms. The house was massive, much larger than she'd realized. Its winding corridors twisted into areas she'd never explored before. She'd opened doors to find unexpected passages, narrow stairs leading downward, or wide, empty rooms that looked more like voids than living spaces. The deeper she ventured, the more unfamiliar the estate became, as if the house itself was shifting to confuse her. It was mid-afternoon when she found the staircase. It was hidden behind a door she'd assumed was just another closet, but when she opened it, a steep, dark stairway plunged downward, leading to what must have been the basement. The air was colder here, damp, thick, and heavy with the scent of mildew and old stone. A faint crimson glow seeped up from the bottom of the stairs, barely visible in the gloom. She hesitated, gripping the railing tightly. Every instinct told her to turn back. But the pull, that strange, otherworldly pull, urged her to descend. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing faintly in the confined space. She descended slowly, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. As she reached the bottom, the crimson glow became brighter, illuminating the stone walls of the basement. They were flick with moisture, moss creeping up their surface like veins. The air grew heavier with each step, until she finally emerged into the room itself. It was unlike anything she'd seen before. The room was painted entirely red. Walls, ceiling, floor, every inch was the same deep blood-like hue. The color wasn't just paint, though. It seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. The light came from no discernible source, yet it filled the space evenly, casting no shadows. In the center of the room stood a single, cracked mirror. Its glass was clouded and distorted, reflecting the red light in fractured, chaotic patterns. The frame was ornate and golden, tarnished with age, and covered in more of those strange symbols she'd seen before, looping, curling designs that seemed to twist and writhe the longer she looked at them. Charlotte approached slowly, her movements hesitant. As she drew closer to the mirror, her own reflection emerged in the cloudy glass. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't quite match her movements. When she tilted her head slightly to the left, her reflection tilted to the right. When she lifted a hand, the reflection's fingers curled inward instead of stretching out. She froze, her chest tightening. It wasn't just a delay, it was deliberate. Her reflection wasn't copying her, it was reacting, almost as though it had its own will. Charlotte stepped back, but the reflection leaned forward, its face still her own, but off. The expression on its face was something she'd never seen on herself before, a slow, widening smile. Too wide. "Hello?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. The reflection mouthed something in return. She couldn't hear the words, but it was unmistakable. It was speaking. Charlotte's legs trembled, but she didn't move. She couldn't move. Her reflection's smile grew until it looked painful, its head tilting to an unnatural angle. Then the glass rippled, just for a moment, like the surface of a pond after a stone had been dropped into it. The reflection returned to normal, her own pale, frightened face staring back. Charlotte stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The room seemed smaller now, the red walls closing in, the air too thick to inhale properly. She turned and rushed for the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silent space. As she climbed, she felt something cold brush against her back, a faint sensation, like a hand barely grazing her shoulder. She refused to look back. When she reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, she leaned against it, breathing hard. Her heart felt like it would burst out of her chest. She stared at the door for a long time, as if expecting it to open on its own, but it didn't. Only the faint, flickering red glow beneath the gap in the door told her that what she'd seen was real. That night, she didn't sleep at all. The mirror haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her reflection had been looking at something just over her shoulder. Something she hadn't seen, but something that had definitely been there. You. The next day, Charlotte avoided the basement entirely. She didn't even go near the door that led to the red room. The memory of the mirror, its warped reflections, the way it seemed to smile of its own accord, was still too fresh, too raw. Instead, she tried to focus on areas of the house that felt less threatening, even as the overall atmosphere pressed down on her like a storm cloud. One feature of the estate had always caught her attention, but until now, she hadn't dared investigate it too closely. The enormous grandfather clock in the entry hall. It stood just to the left of the grand staircase, an imposing thing of dark mahogany and brass. The pendulum no longer swung, and the hands were frozen at midnight. Cobwebs clung to the carved details, and a layer of dust dulled the once polished surface. It hadn't made a sound since she'd arrived, yet something about it drew her in. She approached it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The closer she got, the more she noticed small details, intricate carvings of vines and thorns along the wooden case, tiny scratches on the brass pendulum, and faint, worn symbols etched into the edges of the clock face. The markings were almost invisible, hidden in the ornate design, but when she squinted, she could see the same looping, twisting shapes that appeared on the locked door upstairs, and the mirror's frame in the red room. Her breath hitched. She didn't know why, but her instincts told her that the clock was connected to whatever was happening here. Maybe it's broken, she murmured aloud, though her voice was too soft to fill the cavernous hall. Before she could think better of it, she reached out and turned the knob that opened the clock's face. The glass panel creaked as it swung open, revealing the brass hands inside. She didn't know what she expected to find, but it all looked normal enough. Old, yes, tarnished, but normal. With a shaky hand, she adjusted the minute hand, moving it forward. For a moment, nothing happened. The clock stayed silent. Then, as she prepared to close it again, a sound broke the stillness. Tick. Charlotte froze. The pendulum began to sway ever so slightly, moving back and forth like the heartbeat of the house. Another tick followed, then another, each one louder and more deliberate. She stumbled back, her gaze fixed on the now moving pendulum. It was slow at first, hesitant, but then it found its rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Her stomach twisted. The hands of the clock began to move, not forward, but backward. They jerked at first, then steadily rotated counterclockwise. Midnight gave way to 11:30, then 11, then 10:30. Charlotte's pulse raced as she watched the time reverse, as if the clock were unwinding the hours, drawing the house back into something older, something darker. The chime struck then, a deep, hollow note that resonated through the entire entry hall. 1, 2, 3. The sound was rich and heavy, each tone vibrating in her chest. By the sixth chime, she realized she couldn't move. It wasn't fear that held her rooted to the spot. She physically couldn't lift her legs or tear her eyes away from the clock. Her breath grew shallow as the chimes continued. 9, 10, 11, 12. The final chime hung in the air, echoing long after it should have faded. The pendulum slowed, then stopped. The hands froze again, this time at exactly midnight, the same position they had been in before. Everything returned to silence. But the air felt different. The house felt different. Charlotte backed away, her steps shaky, her pulse hammering in her ears. She closed the glass panel and turned, desperate to escape the hall. As she fled toward the library, she felt it again, that oppressive sensation, as if something unseen was now watching her every move. The clock hadn't just started working again. It had done something. She didn't know what, but she was certain the chimes weren't marking time. They were marking something else entirely. She made it to the library and sat down in one of the heavy armchairs, her body trembling. Her mind raced. Was the clock just another piece of the puzzle, or was it something more? She had thought the house was passive, an old structure harboring secrets. Now she wasn't so sure. The house wasn't just alive, it was waking up. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was swallowed by shadow, Charlotte began hearing them. At first, it was a single whisper. It rose faintly in the stillness of the house, so soft that she wasn't sure if it was real. She sat in the library hunched over one of her uncle's journals, trying to make sense of the bizarre symbols and fragmented notes, when the sound brushed against the edge of her awareness. A wordless murmur, barely audible, like the faintest exhale of breath behind her ear. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. "Hello?" she called, her voice tight, almost shaking. No response. She stood, the floor creaking beneath her as she moved toward the doorway. The sound wasn't there anymore, or maybe it had never been there. She shook her head, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress. But as she returned to the desk, the whisper came again, slightly louder this time. It was a single, drawn-out syllable, soft and indistinct, like someone trying to speak from a great distance. She turned again, faster this time, scanning the room. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching longer across the floor. Her gaze darted to the tall windows, the cracked ceiling, the heavy bookshelves, anything that might explain what she was hearing. But the library was empty. Charlotte decided to move to a different room. She grabbed the journal and headed into the parlor, where she lit a few candles to push back the gloom. The flickering flames cast uneven light, making the furniture seem to shift and bend. She tried to focus on her uncle's notes again, but the whispers followed. Now they were plural overlapping voices that seemed to float just beyond the range of understanding. Some were faint, like a gentle hum, while others came as sharp, clipped phrases in a language she didn't recognize. Her breathing quickened. She dropped the pen, pushing the journal aside, and covered her ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from the room. They were in the house itself. They seemed to drift through the walls, bleeding into the very fabric of the air around her. "Stop," she whispered. "Please just stop." The voices paused, as if they'd heard her. The silence was so sudden and absolute that it made her skin prickle. She waited, her heart pounding, but the quiet held. Slowly, she uncovered her ears, feeling both relieved and unnerved. That's when she heard her name, Charlotte. It was soft, almost intimate, yet it carried a weight that felt like a physical blow. The sound of her own name in a stranger's voice made her stomach twist. The voice didn't seem hostile. If anything, it was almost gentle. But that only made it more terrifying. "Who's there?" she shouted, spinning in place. Her voice sounded small in the vast parlor. The candles flickered violently, nearly snuffing out. No answer came, but the voices resumed, more insistent now. They overlapped in strange, rhythmic patterns, filling her ears with incomprehensible words. A chant, a warning, or perhaps a conversation. She couldn't tell. All she knew was that they were building to something, growing louder and faster. And then, among the tangled whispers, one phrase emerged clearly, repeated over and over in an almost sing-song cadence. "Return what you took." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "I didn't take anything," she shouted. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The voices didn't stop. "Return what you took." The words looped endlessly, echoing in her mind until it felt like her skull might crack under the pressure. She stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape. But the voices followed her. They filled every room, seeped into the hallways, into the walls, into the very air she breathed. The house was alive with sound, surrounding her, swallowing her. Charlotte fled to the foyer, her hands pressed tightly over her ears. The grandfather clock stood still and silent, but she felt as though it were watching her. Her name rang out again, louder this time, commanding her attention. She stopped in the center of the hall, tears streaming down her face, and screamed back at the empty air. "What do you want from me?" The voices fell silent again. A single moment of deafening stillness. Then, very faintly, from somewhere in the depths of the house, she heard the same tapping she'd heard outside the locked room. Tap, tap, tap. Charlotte backed away, her legs trembling. She couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. The house was turning against her. It had a voice now, a voice she couldn't escape, and it was making demands she didn't understand. After that night, Charlotte couldn't bring herself to stay in any one room for long. She moved through the house like a restless ghost, her nerves frayed and her heart constantly racing. She didn't know what the voices wanted or what they meant by return what you took, but their presence clung to her, unrelenting, like a shadow she couldn't escape. By mid-morning, she found herself drawn to the attic. It was the one place she hadn't yet explored, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe she had subconsciously avoided it, wary of what might lurk in the dim, dust-choked space. But now, with the voices still whispering faintly in her ears, she needed some kind of answer, anything that might help her understand what was happening. The attic stairs were steep, each step groaning under her weight. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its weak light barely cutting through the gloom. Cobwebs draped over long-forgotten furniture, trunks stacked haphazardly in the corners. The air was heavy with the smell of mothballs and old wood. Charlotte's eyes roamed the clutter. Boxes of clothes, stacks of books, an old rocking horse missing its mane. None of it seemed unusual. Nothing screamed out as a clue. She was about to leave when she noticed a small wooden chest pushed into the far corner, half hidden beneath a crumbling blanket. Something about it felt important, though she couldn't say why. She knelt down and slid the chest out into the light. The wood was dark and worn, the metal hinges tarnished. Her fingers trembled as she unlatched it, a faint creak breaking the stillness as the lid lifted. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a collection of old photographs. The images were brittle and yellowed, some curling at the edges. Charlotte picked one up carefully and stared at it. It was a black and white photograph of her uncle, much younger than she remembered, standing in front of the house. He smiled warmly, the kind of smile that seemed too big for his face. But as she looked closer, her attention was drawn to the background. Behind him, just barely visible, stood a figure. It was blurry, out of focus, but it was definitely there. A woman dressed in a long black coat, her face turned toward the camera. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was blank, her posture unnaturally stiff. Charlotte's stomach tightened. She knew that face. She'd seen it before, in the portrait above the staircase. It was unmistakably the same woman, though the painting's version of her was more refined, her features sharper. In the photograph, she looked wrong. The longer Charlotte stared, the more the woman seemed to loom over her uncle, as if she were holding him in place. The shadows around her seemed darker, deeper, like they were swallowing the light. She set the photograph down and rifled through the rest. There were more images of her uncle, some with friends, others alone, but every now and then the woman appeared. Sometimes in the distance, sometimes closer, her figure always blurry, her face never fully clear. It was as though she didn't belong in the photos, like she had been added after the fact. Yet she was undeniably present in all of them. Her hands trembled as she reached the last photograph in the stack. It was a smaller print, creased and nearly torn. In this one, her uncle stood in the same spot in front of the house, but the woman was right beside him. Unlike the other images, she was perfectly in focus. She was dressed in the same Victorian-style clothing as the portrait, her hair pinned up, her lips curved in a subtle, eerie smile. And her hand, it wasn't resting on his shoulder. It was gripping his wrist tightly, her fingers digging into his skin as if to hold him in place. Charlotte flipped the photograph over. On the back, scrawled in her uncle's handwriting, were the words, "Don't let her out." Her breath caught. She read it again and again, hoping the meaning would change, but it didn't. Don't let her out. She felt a rising panic, her mind racing. Was her uncle trying to warn her? Was this about the woman in the portrait? The locked room? The voices? She had no way of knowing. but the message felt unmistakably personal. A plea from someone who had lived and died within the grasp of the house's secrets. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a soft creak. She looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the attic was empty. The air was still, and yet she felt it, the undeniable presence of something watching her, waiting. Clutching the photograph, she left the attic, her mind churning with questions. The woman in the portrait wasn't just a painting. She was real, or had been once. But who was she? And why was she still here, haunting the estate and its halls? The photograph had given her a piece of the puzzle, but it also brought new fears. What had her uncle meant by "don't let her out"? As she descended the attic stairs, she could still hear the faint whispers, "Return what you took." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and for the first time, she wondered if the voices weren't talking about her uncle. She wondered if they were talking about her. By now, the house had become an oppressive force. Charlotte rarely slept, her nights filled with strange sounds and shadows that moved where they shouldn't. The voice that called her name, the incessant tapping from behind the locked door, and the photographs of the woman in black haunted her every waking moment. Still, she felt trapped, unable to leave, as if the house itself wouldn't let her go. It was around midnight when she first noticed the scratches. She had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water, needing something to steady her nerves. As she returned to the master bedroom, the dim light from her flashlight caught something on the bedroom door. Shallow, jagged lines, 3 parallel scratches, ran vertically down the wood, their edges splintered and raw. They hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. Her breath quickened as she moved closer. The scratches weren't deep, but they were unmistakable. She reached out hesitantly, tracing them with her fingertips. The grooves were fresh. Tiny splinters fell away under her touch. A shiver ran down her spine as she considered how they could have gotten there. She locked the door every night before trying to sleep, and the hallway outside had been quiet, hadn't it? She pulled the door closed and latched it again, her hands trembling. Returning to bed, she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe the scratches had been there all along. Maybe she was so rattled by the voices and the photographs that she was imagining things. She crawled under the blankets, pulling them up to her chin, and kept the flashlight clutched in her hand. She tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the house set her nerves on edge. When she woke in the morning, she found 4 new scratches alongside the original 3. They were deeper this time, carving more forcefully into the wood. Panic bubbled in her chest. She checked the door's latch. It was still secured, just as it had been when she'd locked it the night before. But the scratches were undeniable, as if something had been trying to claw its way in. Over the next few days, the scratches kept appearing. Each night, a new set of marks marred the door, sometimes longer, sometimes deeper, but always fresh. Charlotte started sleeping less and less. She kept the chair wedged under the doorknob, though she knew it was a feeble attempt at security. She'd sit up in bed with the flashlight on, waiting, listening, but she never caught anything in the act. The scratches just appeared, as if something invisible was dragging claws down the wood while she wasn't looking. She began hearing noises in the hallway, too soft scuffling, like footsteps that never quite reached her door. At times, she thought she heard the faintest scratching sounds, but whenever she leaped out of bed and flung the door open, the hall would be empty. Marks were always there, though fresh and waiting. It was as if the house was toying with her, playing some cruel game she couldn't escape. One night, after a particularly long day spent combing through more of her uncle's journals, Charlotte finally dozed off in the early hours of the morning. She was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy slamming against the door. Her heart raced as she grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the entrance. The noise stopped, but the air felt colder, heavier. She could barely bring herself to move. She sat frozen in bed, her breath shallow, staring at the door for what felt like hours. When she finally summoned the courage to get up, the scratches had multiplied. This time they weren't confined to one section of the door. Long, jagged lines crisscrossed the wood from top to bottom, gouging deeper than ever before. Charlotte's stomach churned. This wasn't the house settling or a random animal sneaking inside. This was deliberate. Something or someone was trying to get in. She couldn't deny it any longer. By morning, she had made up her mind to confront it. She placed a heavy piece of furniture against the door before locking it again, and then she waited. The day passed in tense silence, each tick of the grandfather clock reminding her that nightfall was coming. She read through more of her uncle's notes, looking for anything, any clue that could explain what was happening. But the journals were fragmented, disjointed. He'd written about hearing things, seeing things, even feeling something following him. He mentioned the scratches too, though he had never found a source. The only thing he kept repeating was the same phrase Charlotte had heard whispered in the dark: "Return what you took." That night, as darkness swallowed the house once again, Charlotte braced herself. She sat in bed, the flashlight aimed at the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. The silence dragged on, minutes turned to hours, and still nothing happened. She began to think that maybe it was over, that whatever had been causing the scratches had finally stopped. And just before dawn came the first slow, deliberate scratch. The sound of something dragging against the door, long and purposeful, sent a wave of terror through her. The flashlight shook in her hand as she stared at the door, unable to look away. The scratching stopped. A single sharp knock followed, echoing through the room like a gunshot. And then, silence. Charlotte didn't sleep again that night. She didn't even move. She simply sat there, her hands trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. When morning came, the door was covered in new scratches, deeper than ever, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wanted her to open the door. Something was trying to get in. And soon she feared it wouldn't be asking. The next morning, Charlotte stood before the parlor's rug, her heart racing. She had dragged it aside after spotting its frayed edges curling up, revealing the outline of a trapdoor. At first, she'd tried to ignore it. The estate was already drowning her in mysteries. Adding a hidden basement to the list felt like a step too far. But after another sleepless night spent listening to the scratching, the whispers, and the unseen footfalls, she couldn't resist any longer. The trapdoor's handle was tarnished brass, worn smooth with time. She hesitated for a long moment before gripping it and pulling. The wood creaked and groaned as the door opened, revealing a narrow set of stairs descending into darkness. A wave of cold, damp air rolled up to meet her, heavy with the scent of earth, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Charlotte retrieved her flashlight, its beam cutting weakly into the blackness below. Her legs felt like lead as she descended, each step producing an echo that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the basement walls were farther apart than they should have been. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, until she could see her breath in front of her. The basement was not what she expected. It wasn't a storage area or a wine cellar. Instead, the space was bare stone, rough-hewn walls lined with creeping moss and dirt. The floor was uneven, scattered with rocks and debris. It felt more like a cave than a part of the house. The flashlight's glow revealed strange markings scratched into the walls, symbols similar to those she'd seen on the locked door upstairs, in the ornate frame of the red room's mirror. They twisted and looped, seeming almost alive as the beam passed over them. In the center of the room stood a stone altar. It was low and rectangular, its surface pitted and stained with dark, crusted streaks. The sight of it made Charlotte's stomach churn. The stains were too dark, too deep to be simply rust or mildew. She didn't want to imagine what might have caused them, but the coppery tang in the air told her everything she needed to know. Her uncle had mentioned this place in his journal. In one of his most desperate entries, he wrote, "I tried to understand, but it's older than me, older than the house. I sealed it as best I could, but the whispers remain. The altar is not enough. It will never be enough." Charlotte stepped closer, though her body screamed at her to turn and leave. She didn't touch the altar. She couldn't bring herself to. But she noticed something wedged into a small crevice in the stone. A thin piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle. She used the edge of her flashlight to pry it free, her fingers trembling as she held it up to the light. The writing was faded, written in a hand much older than her uncle's. She couldn't read the words, if they were even in a language she recognized, but the symbols and looping patterns matched those on the walls. The parchment seemed to hum faintly in her hands, though that might have been her imagination. As she read it, or tried to, the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. They didn't seem to be coming from any one direction. They were all around her, filling the room, overlapping, a cacophony of sounds that she couldn't understand, but that made her head pound and her chest tighten. "Return what you took," the voices said, clearer now. "Return what you took." Charlotte turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there. But she was alone, the flashlight beam swinging wildly over the walls. Her breathing was fast and shallow, and she could feel sweat on her forehead despite the cold. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were inside her head, burrowing into her thoughts, repeating that same phrase over and over again. "Return what you took." She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose rock. She hit the ground hard, the flashlight tumbling from her hand and rolling away. The light flickered, throwing erratic shadows across the basement. In those shifting shadows, she thought she saw movement, dark shapes flitting across the edges of the room, too quick to be real, but too vivid to ignore. Charlotte scrambled to her feet, grabbing the flashlight and spinning in place. The whispers were deafening now, a rising tide of noise that drowned out her own panicked breathing. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the voices. The air grew heavier and heavier until it felt like the very room was closing in on her. Finally, she fled. She didn't care what she left behind. She didn't care if she dropped the parchment or if she never learned what it said. She just ran, up the stairs, out of the trapdoor, and into the relative safety of the house above. She slammed the trapdoor shut and pushed the rug back into place, as if that could keep the whispers and the suffocating darkness below. For hours, she sat in the kitchen, shaking and unable to think straight. The voices had stopped when she reached the main floor, but she could still feel them lingering at the edges of her mind, waiting for her to come back. They hadn't gone away. Not really. They were simply biding their time. It was then that Charlotte understood something she hadn't been willing to admit before. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just old and strange and full of her uncle's secrets. It was something more. Something alive. Something hungry. And now she was caught in its grip. After the incident in the basement, Charlotte was certain she couldn't stay another night in the house. The voices, the scratches, the overwhelming sense that she was being hunted by something unseen. It was all too much. She packed her things in a rush, shoving clothes and notebooks into her bag with trembling hands. The house felt even colder than before, its silence oppressive and unyielding. The whispers had quieted, but she knew they weren't gone. She felt them lingering in the walls, just out of reach, waiting. As evening fell, Charlotte planned her escape. Her car was parked out front, ready to take her away from this nightmare. She knew she'd have to explain the situation to the estate's executor, maybe even hire someone to deal with the house's many issues. But that would come later. Right now, she just needed to leave. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow in the corners of her vision made her skin crawl. She couldn't stand another minute in this place. The moment she stepped out the front door, she froze. Figures stood at the edge of the forest, just beyond the property line. They were shadowy shapes at first, blending into the twilight, but as she stared, they became clearer. Several of them, all dressed in dark, loose clothing that seemed too old-fashioned for the current century. They stood perfectly still, their faces turned toward the house, toward her. She couldn't make out their features in the dim light, but she didn't need to. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself had extended its influence outside. Charlotte's heart pounded. She gripped the strap of her bag tightly, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you?" she called, her voice wavering. No one answered. The figures remained motionless. She stepped closer to the porch's edge, squinting against the fading light. "What do you want?" she asked, louder this time. Still no response. They didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if they were frozen in time, like statues. Yet Charlotte could feel their presence, could sense their eyes, if they had eyes, locked onto her. Her mind raced. Were these the spirits her uncle had written about? The ones he had tried to appease or ward off? Or were they something else entirely? She thought about the basement, the strange symbols carved into the walls, the dark stains on the altar. Were these figures tied to that place, drawn to whatever had been sealed or unsealed down there? She wanted to turn and run back into the house, but her legs wouldn't move. Something about the figures held her in place. They didn't move closer. They didn't make a sound. They simply watched. The stillness became unbearable. Finally, Charlotte forced herself to look away. She ran back inside and slammed the door, locking it behind her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the entrance, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself that she had imagined them, that her stress and exhaustion were making her see things. But deep down, she knew they were real. She crept toward the window, parting the curtain just enough to glance outside. The figures were still there, unmoving. She closed the curtain quickly and pressed her back against the wall, trying to calm her breathing. As the evening wore on, the tension in the house grew unbearable. The air was so heavy it felt like a weight on her chest. And outside, the figures remained, silent and still, their dark silhouettes barely visible through the windows. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder. A low chorus that filled the halls. Charlotte covered her ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside her own head. She spent the night on the floor of the parlor, wrapped in a blanket, her bag clutched against her chest. She didn't dare move. Each time she peeked outside, the figures were still there, their numbers seeming to grow. By dawn, she counted a dozen of them, all standing in the same still, watching positions. They had formed a loose semicircle around the front yard, like they were waiting for something or someone. When the first rays of sunlight spilled over the treetops, the figures were gone. Charlotte stumbled out onto the porch, her legs weak, her heart racing. She stared at the empty yard, the forest edge where the visitors had been. The ground where they had stood was scorched. The grass and soil were blackened, as though something had burned there in the night. The sight made her stomach twist. She glanced back at the house, its windows dark and lifeless. It felt like the house was watching her, waiting for her reaction. The burned patches were a reminder, a message. The visitors weren't just spirits. They were connected to the house in some way she didn't understand. And they weren't going to leave. Not really. Charlotte's resolve to escape wavered. She didn't know where she would go or what would happen if she tried to leave. The house, the visitors, the whispers, they weren't done with her. The house had been waiting for her to arrive, and now it had her. It wasn't going to let her go so easily. Charlotte felt like she was slowly losing herself. The house, the voices, the visitors, they all worked in tandem, wearing her down, bit by bit. The fleeting hope she'd clung to was slipping through her fingers. Still, she tried to maintain some semblance of control, some routine to keep herself grounded. That night, she decided to light candles throughout the parlor. It wasn't just for illumination. The warm glow made the oppressive darkness feel less all-encompassing. The flickering flames seemed to give her a fragile sense of safety, as if they might keep the whispering shadows at bay. She set them on the mantel, the side tables, and the old grand piano pushed into one corner of the room. The house's electricity had been unreliable from the start, and tonight the wiring seemed worse than ever. Lights flickered, then refused to turn on at all, leaving her with nothing but the candles and her flashlight. She lit a final taper and placed it on the main coffee table before collapsing into an armchair. The room took on a softer glow, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to think that maybe she could endure one more night. That hope didn't last long. The flickering began almost immediately. At first, she assumed it was just the natural unsteadiness of flames. A gust of air from a drafty window, perhaps. But the candles closest to her didn't flicker as if blown by a breeze. They swayed erratically, dancing as if invisible fingers were playing with them. She leaned forward, staring at the nearest candle. Its flame darted left, then right, then doubled in size before shrinking down to a faint, trembling glow. She reached out a hand, hesitant, to shield it, but nothing changed. A prickling sensation crept up her spine. The flames across the room began to behave similarly, each one flickering in an unnatural rhythm, like a silent message being conveyed through the shifting light. Her breathing quickened, and she turned toward the window, hoping to see an explanation. Perhaps another set of visitors standing at the forest's edge. Perhaps some trick of the wind or the trees. What she saw instead made her stomach drop. A single figure stood just outside the glass, staring in. The candlelight didn't reach them fully. They remained mostly in shadow. The faint outline of their face appeared for a moment as the flames flared. It was a woman, pale skin, dark hollowed eyes, and a faint, crooked smile. Charlotte recognized that face immediately. The woman from the portrait. The woman from the photographs. Charlotte jerked back in her seat, her heart slamming in her chest. She grabbed the flashlight, fumbling with it, but by the time she raised it toward the window, the figure was gone. The light reflected only her own panicked expression in the glass. The whispering returned then, stronger than before. It didn't come from one place. It surrounded her, filling the room, slipping through the walls. The flames on the candles grew tall and bright, casting sharp, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The figures in those shadows began to take shape. Charlotte saw long, spindly arms, twisting heads, and slanted eyes that stared down at her. They grew clearer with each passing moment, moving with the rhythm of the whispering. "Leave," she whispered to the house, to whatever was in the room with her. "Leave me alone." The shadows didn't obey. They closed in, tightening their circle. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere. She clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, swinging it toward the walls, toward the shadows, toward anything that moved. A beam cut through the darkness, but couldn't stop the shadows from reforming. They crawled back into the corners, then slithered forward again, relentless. The candles started going out, one by one. Each time a flame died, the room grew colder. Charlotte felt her breath come in shallow gasps. She backed against the farthest wall, gripping the flashlight so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath her. The last candle on the coffee table sputtered, the flame shrinking until it was no more than a faint ember. The whispering rose to a fever pitch, and she thought she could make out individual words now, though they didn't make sense. Fragments of sentences in languages she didn't understand. mingled with her name spoken again and again. When the last candle went out, the room was plunged into total darkness. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They were figures, solid and unmistakable. She could hear them moving now, hear the faint scrape of something sharp against the floor, hear the low, guttural murmurs as they shifted closer. The flashlight flickered, its beam cutting out for a second before sputtering back to life. In that brief moment of light, she saw them fully for the first time, twisted, gaunt forms with hollow eyes that gleamed faintly in the dark. They were all around her, closing the distance. Charlotte screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly, the beam flashing across their faces before they vanished into the darkness again. The voices peaked, a deafening crescendo that made her head feel like it was going to split in two. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she pressed herself harder against the wall, searching for some escape, any escape. And then, all at once, the whispering stopped. The silence was as overwhelming as the noise had been. Her flashlight beam cut through the empty parlor, finding nothing. The shadows were gone. The figures were gone. She stood there, shaking, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The only sound was the faint dripping of wax from the extinguished candles, pooling onto the wooden surfaces below. The house had gone still again, but Charlotte knew this was only temporary. It was playing with her, testing her limits, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. The morning after the candles had burned out, Charlotte awoke on the floor of the parlor, wrapped in a blanket she barely remembered grabbing. Her body ached from sleeping against the hardwood, but it was the silence that jarred her most. It wasn't the ordinary stillness of dawn. It was a heavy, almost palpable hush, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She rose shakily, trying to shake the lingering memories of the shadows. The whispering had stopped sometime in the night, and the creeping figures had vanished along with it. For now, the house seemed to have retreated, leaving her in a fragile calm, but she knew it wouldn't last. As she moved into the hallway, her bare feet brushed against something light and crinkly. She looked down and saw a piece of paper lying on the floor just outside the parlor. It hadn't been there the night before, of that she was certain. Her chest tightened as she bent down to pick it up. The edges were ragged, as though torn hastily from a larger sheet, and the paper felt rough to the touch. The handwriting was hers. She stared at it, her stomach twisting into knots. The words were written in her own uneven scrawl, but she knew she hadn't written them. She couldn't have. "Leave now, you're in danger." Charlotte's throat tightened. She read it over and over, hoping the meaning would change, that the words would shift and reveal themselves as some kind of illusion. But they didn't. They stayed exactly as they were, a warning written in her own hand by someone or something trying to reach her. "Who?" she whispered to the empty air, but no answer came. She clutched the paper, her mind racing. Why would the house give her this message? It had spent days tormenting her, battering her with whispers, visions, and shadows. Why warn her now? Was it trying to push her out, or was it manipulating her, drawing her into another trap? Her uncle's journal flashed through her mind, his frantic scrawl, his warnings about the house's strange forces, the woman in the portrait, the scratches on the door. He had been desperate to leave, but he hadn't. Had the house sent him warnings too? Had he ignored them, only to end up another piece of its grim history? She shoved the note into her pocket and headed upstairs, her heart pounding. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was something deeper, a sense that she needed to see the locked door again. The note's words echoed in her mind as she ascended. "Leave now, you're in danger." But she didn't turn back. When she reached the top of the staircase, her eyes were immediately drawn to the painting. The woman in the portrait looked as she always had, poised, elegant, her expression unreadable. But Charlotte thought she detected something different in her gaze. The eyes, sharp and pale, seemed to gleam just a little more than before, as if catching some invisible light. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she forced herself to look away. A locked door at the end of the hall stood exactly as she'd left it. Its dark wood seemed to drink in the dim light filtering through the window, and the brass handle glinted faintly. The symbols carved into the door were more noticeable now. She didn't know if they had always been this prominent, or if her mind was just focusing on them more, but they seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The sight made her palms sweat. Charlotte approached it cautiously, the note's warning still heavy in her pocket. She placed her hand on the cold brass handle, testing it again. It didn't move. She pushed her shoulder against the door, trying to force it open, but it was sealed as firmly as ever. Her eyes wandered to the frame of the door, the faint carvings that marked its edges. They were similar to the ones she'd seen in the basement and on the mirror in the red room, looping and twisting like vines. Her uncle's journal had mentioned these symbols, how he'd carved them himself, believing they would hold something back. But what was behind the door? Was it what she was supposed to return? Was it what the voices meant? "Why are you locked?" she whispered, her voice trembling. As if in answer, the faint tapping returned. It was so soft that she almost thought she imagined it. But when she pressed her ear to the door, she heard it clearly. 3 slow, deliberate taps, as though someone on the other side was knocking to get her attention. Her breath caught in her throat. She waited, but the sound didn't repeat. The paper in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. "Leave now. You're in danger." The words burned in her mind, conflicting with the strange pull she felt toward this door, toward the unknown. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering. The house seemed to be daring her, challenging her to stay, to dig deeper. Yet that note was the first thing that had felt like a direct message to her, as if something or someone inside the house wanted her to escape. She returned to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She dug the note from her pocket, unfolding it with shaky hands. The ink shimmered faintly in the sunlight, and she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint, acrid smell. It was subtle but unmistakable. Sulfur, like something burned. She dropped the paper onto the desk, her skin crawling. It didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk as she tried to steady herself. The house wasn't done with her. The note was just another piece of its puzzle, another game it was playing. But this time, there was a choice. Obey the warning and leave, or stay and face whatever was waiting behind that door. Charlotte stared out the window at the forest beyond the estate, the line of trees blurring in the afternoon light. The stillness outside felt deceptive. She'd survived another night, but the house wasn't giving up, and neither was she. The note's warning hung over Charlotte like a dark cloud. She carried it with her all day, crumpled in her pocket, unable to decide what it meant or who had left it. "Leave now. You're in danger." The words were simple, but the more she thought about them, the more tangled their meaning became. Why now? Why not days ago, when the whispers first started? Why not before the shadows began crawling from the corners of the house? She spent the morning pacing the hallways, aimlessly moving through the rooms, trying to sort her thoughts. Every now and then, she caught herself glancing up the staircase, her eyes drawn to the door at the end of the hall. By late afternoon, she'd resolved to try again. The locked room had tormented her since the day she arrived. She had to know what was inside, what her uncle had sealed away, what the house had been trying so hard to keep hidden. The note's warning weighed heavy in her mind, but her curiosity and her desperation had grown stronger. Charlotte climbed the stairs slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched her flashlight. The light outside was fading, the shadows in the hallways growing long and thin. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The door was still closed, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. For a moment, she thought she heard something on the other side, a faint scuffling, like fabric brushing against the floor. But when she pressed her ear to the door, It fell silent again. This time, the handle turned. Charlotte's breath caught. She hadn't even tried to open it yet, but when her fingers brushed the cold brass knob, it shifted slightly, no longer frozen in place. The realization sent a chill down her spine. She hadn't unlocked it. No one had. The door creaked as it swung inward. The room beyond was dim and still, bathed in a cold, pale light that seemed to have no source. Charlotte stepped inside, her flashlight's beam slicing through the gloom. It wasn't the empty, forgotten space she'd expected. Instead, it was a child's bedroom. The furniture was old but well preserved. A small bed with neatly folded blankets, a toy chest pushed against the far wall, and shelves lined with dusty books and stuffed animals. The air was heavy with the scent of age and mildew, but underneath it was something else. A faint, sweet smell, almost like flowers, that made her feel uneasy. Charlotte's gaze fell on the nightstand. It held a single object, a music box. It was small and ornate, its brass surface etched with delicate patterns. She approached it carefully, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The box was wound, but not playing. She could see the tiny key sticking out from the side, ready to turn. Her uncle's journal hadn't mentioned anything like this. He'd spoken of sealing the door, carving symbols into the frame to keep something inside. But he hadn't said what was in the room. He hadn't mentioned a child's bedroom or a music box. She hesitated, then reached out and turned the key. The music started softly, a simple haunting melody that filled the small room. The sound was sweet, almost nostalgic, but there was something about it that set her teeth on edge. It was the kind of tune that should have been comforting, yet it sent a shiver through her entire body. As the music played, she heard it again, laughter. Faint at first, but growing louder. A child's laugh, light and airy, as if carried on a breeze. She spun around, shining her flashlight into every corner of the room, but there was no one there. The laughter didn't fade, though. It danced around her, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice shaking. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the soft, chiming notes of the music box. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Charlotte whirled around, her heart racing. She grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked again, just as before. Her flashlight flickered, and she felt the room grow colder. The sweet scent in the air grew stronger, almost sickly. The music box slowed, its melody warping, the notes dragging as though the mechanism was struggling to keep up. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She staggered back, her flashlight beam darting around the room. The furniture remained still, the shelves untouched, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. A voice, faint and childlike, whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't have opened it." Charlotte froze. The whisper was so quiet she wasn't sure she'd heard it at first. But then it came again, closer. "You shouldn't have opened it." The music box came to a halt with a final jarring note. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to shift, creeping closer, growing taller and darker. Charlotte backed into the corner, her hands trembling, the flashlight flickering more violently. The sweet scent became unbearable, and the whispers rose in a crescendo, overlapping until they became an incomprehensible hum. The room began to blur, the edges of her vision darkening. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the music box snapping shut on its own, the key turning back in a smooth, deliberate motion. Charlotte woke to complete silence. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that made every small sound seem deafening. She was no longer in the child's bedroom. Instead, she was sprawled on the floor of her own room, the blanket half pulled off her bed. Her flashlight lay beside her, its bulb flickering faintly before finally going out. She didn't remember leaving the locked room. She didn't remember anything after the music box had stopped. Sitting up, she tried to collect her thoughts. Her body felt stiff and cold, as though she'd been lying there for hours. She scanned the room, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the corner. But the room was empty. A locked door down the hall, however, still gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. The fact that she'd been in that room, that the door had opened on its own, it didn't make sense. She reached for the flashlight, shaking it to see if it would work, but it only sputtered weakly before giving out completely. With no other source of light, she decided to go downstairs, where the morning sun would at least illuminate the parlor. She moved carefully, the floorboards creaking under her feet. Every sound felt magnified in the house's eerie quiet. As she descended the staircase, she became aware of a new sensation, an uncomfortable pressure, like someone was watching her. She froze mid-step, holding her breath, and glanced over her shoulder. The staircase was empty, the hallway beyond dim but still. Yet the feeling remained. It was as if something unseen had stepped into her personal space, standing just behind her, silent and watchful. Her heart began to race. She turned back toward the stairs and quickened her pace, nearly stumbling in her haste. By the time she reached the parlor, she was shaking. Sunlight filtered through the windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. It should have felt safe, normal even, but the sensation of being followed hadn't gone away. She stood in the center of the room, turning in slow circles, trying to pinpoint the source of her unease. The shadows remained still. The furniture hadn't moved. Everything appeared exactly as she'd left it. Yet the pressure persisted, an invisible presence that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. It wasn't the same as the voices or the whispers. This was different. This felt closer. She took a deep breath and forced herself to sit on the couch, her hands gripping her knees tightly. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "If you're here, show yourself." Nothing happened. The room remained silent, but the pressure didn't fade. It hovered over her, a weight on her shoulders that refused to lift. It was as though something was standing directly behind her, leaning in, close enough that she should have felt its breath on her neck. She twisted suddenly, expecting to catch it off guard, but the space behind her was empty. "Show yourself," she demanded again, louder this time. A house didn't respond. The shadows didn't move. But as she stared at the empty space in front of her, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a sigh. The pressure eased for a moment, only to return with even greater intensity. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she realized she was gripping the edge of the couch so tightly that her fingers hurt. Then something happened that made her stomach drop. Her reflection in the large mirror above the mantel moved. It was subtle at first, a slight tilt of the head, a shift in posture. She froze, staring at her reflection. Her own face stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but her head seemed slightly off-center, as though it had turned just a fraction of a second too late. Her reflection's hands weren't gripping the couch the same way hers were. The differences were minor, but they were enough to send a chill through her entire body. Her breathing quickened. She raised one hand, and her reflection mimicked her, though it felt a beat too slow. She tried again, moving her head to the side, watching as the mirrored version of herself hesitated before following suit. The longer she stared, the more certain she became. Whatever was in the mirror wasn't her. It looked like her. It mimicked her movements, but it wasn't her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The reflection smiled. It was quick, a flash of teeth that vanished as soon as she blinked. But she saw it. Her own reflection had smiled at her, though her face hadn't moved. She scrambled off the couch, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the wall. The mirror remained unchanged, her reflection now perfectly aligned with her movements again. But she knew what she'd seen. She knew it wasn't in her head. The presence she'd felt behind her was now in the mirror. Charlotte turned and bolted from the parlor, her footsteps echoing loudly through the empty house. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, but when she grabbed the handle, it wouldn't turn. She tugged harder, her panic growing, but the door refused to budge. She looked over her shoulder. The parlor was visible from here, the mirror's surface gleaming faintly in the morning light. Her reflection stood in the room, just barely visible at this distance. And though she couldn't make out her face from here, she knew it was smiling again. Charlotte stumbled back from the front door, her heart racing. She couldn't force it open, no matter how hard she tried, and the feeling of being trapped, truly trapped, sank into her chest like a heavy stone. The morning sunlight pouring through the windows offered no comfort. It only seemed to highlight how empty the house was, how lifeless and still, except for her. Except for her. As Charlotte turned, her eyes were drawn, as always, to the top of the staircase and the painting that hung there. The woman in the portrait, her still, cold gaze, the unnerving tilt of her head that Charlotte had become too accustomed to. But something was different. The woman's head was no longer tilted slightly to the left. It was turned sharply to the side, angled downward, looking at Charlotte. No longer just a subtle change in direction, but a direct, deliberate shift. The figure in the painting was staring down at her, as though aware of her every move. A shiver crawled up Charlotte's spine. She shook her head, blinking rapidly. Maybe she was seeing things. Maybe the stress was catching up to her. But no matter how many times she looked away, the painting's head remained fixed in that unnatural pose, her eyes boring into Charlotte's. "Why are you watching me?" Charlotte whispered, her voice cracking in the empty hall. The house gave no answer. The painting certainly didn't speak. But the oppressive weight in the air seemed heavier, the shadows around the staircase deeper. She took a cautious step closer, clutching her flashlight tightly, even though it was useless in the daylight. Her breathing grew shallow as she neared the bottom of the stairs. The closer she got, the more details she noticed. The woman's smile, if it could even be called that, was faint but unnerving. It seemed to have grown, as if the corners of her mouth had stretched ever so slightly, curling upward into something that wasn't quite joy. Her hands, which had been resting delicately on her lap, now appeared tense, the fingers curling in as if she were gripping something unseen. Charlotte's skin prickled. She couldn't stand to look at the portrait any longer, yet her legs carried her up the stairs, closer to it. She had to know if she was imagining this. She had to see it up close. With each step, the house seemed to grow quieter, the creaks under her feet louder. The air thickened, pressing against her chest until it was hard to breathe. By the time she reached the landing, she was trembling. She stopped in front of the painting, looking up at the woman's face. Her skin was impossibly pale, her eyes unnaturally sharp, and that faint, widening smile. It was wrong. It felt like it didn't belong on her face. Charlotte reached out, her hand hovering just inches from the frame. She didn't know what she intended to do. Maybe she'd touch it, feel the canvas, prove to herself it was just paint and not something alive. Maybe she'd turn it around, see if there was something hidden on the back. But before she could touch it, the air shifted again. A faint sound, like fabric brushing against the wall, came from behind her. Charlotte froze, her breath catching. She turned slowly, gripping the flashlight as though it might protect her. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It was stronger now, sharper. She looked back at the painting, and her heart nearly stopped. The woman's hands were no longer resting on her lap. They were raised, her fingers splayed as though reaching out, and her head was no longer just turned slightly. It had tilted fully downward, her chin nearly resting on her chest, her eyes staring directly into Charlotte's. A cold, metallic taste filled Charlotte's mouth as panic took over. She backed away from the painting, step by shaky step, until she reached the edge of the staircase. Her foot slipped, and she grabbed the railing to steady herself. The flashlight fell from her hand and clattered down the steps, its beam spinning wildly. For a brief moment, the light caught the portrait again, and Charlotte saw something that made her blood run cold. The woman's hand was no longer in the frame. Charlotte's eyes darted to the edge of the canvas, where she thought she saw the faintest ripple, just a slight shift in the paint, like fabric stretching. Her chest heaved as she tried to calm her breathing, but her thoughts were spinning. The woman's hand was reaching for her. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But the painting was empty. The hand was gone. Charlotte stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping as she reached the bottom. She grabbed the flashlight, but it wouldn't stop shaking in her hand. She looked back up at the painting, hoping, praying that she had imagined it all. The woman's hand was back in place, resting on her lap, her head tilted ever so slightly, her faint smile frozen in its original position, just as it had always been. Charlotte turned and ran. She didn't care if the front door wouldn't open. She didn't care if the house wouldn't let her leave. She ran for the parlor, throwing herself into the corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall. She stared at the hallway, half expecting the woman from the portrait to come walking down the stairs, smiling that unnatural smile, her hand no longer confined to the canvas. But nothing came, only silence, only the still suffocating silence of the house. That night, the house grew restless. It wasn't just the usual whispers or fleeting shadows. Something deeper was happening. The air felt charged. The walls themselves seemed to hum faintly. And Charlotte could no longer deny that the house was alive in ways she couldn't comprehend. She stayed in the parlor, gripping her uncle's journal, desperately searching for answers she hadn't yet found. But it was like trying to piece together a shredded map. The entries jumped from ramblings about the voices to cryptic warnings about the door. His writing became increasingly erratic, full of phrases like "I must seal it away" and "it's feeding on me." It was only when she flipped to the final few pages that she noticed something new, something she had previously skipped over in her panicked readings. A list of materials, a method, instructions that her uncle had hastily scrawled in uneven letters. The notes detailed a ritual that could banish the hunger, as he called it. But he had also written over and over, "It's never enough." Charlotte's hands trembled as she read the steps. It was a strange, almost nonsensical combination of actions. Light every candle in the house. Use a specific chant. Draw a certain symbol in ashes on the floor. It sounded absurd, but then, so did the shadows in the mirror, the whispers in the walls, and the woman in the portrait who seemed to watch her every move. If her uncle had attempted this ritual, it might have been the last thing he did before the house consumed him. And yet, what choice did she have? "Maybe," she whispered. "Maybe it's the only way to stop this." She gathered what she needed: candles from the kitchen, matches, an old stick of chalk to trace the markings when the ashes weren't clear enough. As she moved through the house, she felt the walls pressing in closer. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. "Return what you took." The words repeated over and over, echoing through the halls, growing sharper and angrier. Something didn't want her to perform the ritual. "Too bad," she muttered, her voice shaking. "I'm doing it anyway." She began in the parlor. The instructions were clear: start at the center of the house. Light the candles, draw the symbols, repeat the chant. She followed them exactly, placing the candles in a rough circle on the floor and striking each match carefully. The faint glow of the flames flickered against the walls, and for a brief moment, the room seemed calmer. The whispers receded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Charlotte knelt and began to draw the symbols. Her hand was unsteady, but she managed to form the looping shapes her uncle had drawn in the journal. The chalk scraped against the wood, leaving white marks that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. When the first set was complete, she whispered the chant he had written, her voice barely audible at first. "Sancta eos claudere portas, dimitere spiritus." As soon as the words left her mouth, the house responded. A deep, guttural groan reverberated through the floorboards. The whispers returned, now a chaotic chorus, shouting over each other in anger and fear. The flames on the candles danced wildly, almost extinguishing before stabilizing again. Charlotte felt a sharp pressure in her head, as though the house were pushing back against her efforts. She continued chanting, louder now, the Latin phrases stumbling off her tongue as the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. Sancta eos, claudere portas, dimitere spiritus. The words felt wrong in her mouth, yet she couldn't stop. The symbols on the floor started to glow faintly, and the oppressive presence that had haunted her for days began to falter. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the house's very foundations. Charlotte gritted her teeth and repeated the chant once more, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. And then the flames went out. The room plunged into darkness. Only the faint glow of the symbols on the floor remained, pulsing faintly like dying embers. The hum stopped. The whispers stopped. Everything was still. Charlotte held her breath, waiting for something to happen, for the house to respond, for the woman in the portrait to step out of the canvas, for the shadows to surge forward and drag her into the floorboards. But nothing came, just silence. Slowly she stood, the darkness pressing in around her. Her hands shook as she reached for her flashlight and clicked it on. The beam revealed the room exactly as it was before, candles extinguished, symbols smudged, but still visible. She turned, sweeping the light across the parlor. No movement, no shadows, no whispering voices. For the first time in days, the house felt still. "Did it work?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it over?" She wanted to believe it, wanted to think the ritual had banished whatever had plagued her uncle, and now her. But in the back of her mind, a single phrase from his journal haunted her. It's never enough. The house was silent, for now. The silence didn't last long. As Charlotte moved through the house, picking up the extinguished candles and smudged chalk, the air around her seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure, a barely perceptible vibration in the walls. But with each passing moment, it grew stronger. The shadows that had been motionless just minutes ago began to stir again, sliding slowly across the floor and climbing the walls like living things. Charlotte's stomach churned. "No," she whispered to herself. "No, I did the ritual. I followed everything. This was supposed to work." The house didn't respond. Instead, the pressure in the air intensified, pushing against her like an invisible tide. She backed away, her heart hammering, and turned toward the grand staircase. That's when she saw it, the woman from the portrait. She wasn't in the painting anymore. The figure stood at the top of the stairs, her long black dress flowing as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. Her head was tilted at that unnatural angle, her lips curved into that faint, eerie smile. Her pale eyes locked on Charlotte, cold and unblinking. For a moment, Charlotte couldn't move. It wasn't just fear that paralyzed her. It was the woman's presence, heavy and all-consuming, as though she had stepped out of a nightmare and into the waking world. "What? What do you want?" Charlotte stammered. The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. The house seemed to answer for her. The floor beneath Charlotte's feet groaned, and the walls around her trembled. The symbols she had drawn began to glow faintly once more, but instead of stabilizing the room, they only seemed to agitate it further. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. They came from every corner, every surface, overlapping in a deafening cacophony. The woman began to descend the stairs. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her gaze never leaving Charlotte. The shadows followed her, coiling at her feet like smoke. Charlotte's mind raced. The ritual hadn't banished anything. It had released it. Panic surged through her. She turned and ran for the front door, yanking at the handle. It still wouldn't budge. She beat her fists against it, shouting, but the house only responded with another low, rumbling groan. The walls seemed to pulse, and the floor beneath her feet buckled slightly, as if the entire structure was alive and breathing. Charlotte spun around, looking for another way out, but the woman was already halfway down the stairs. Her smile widened slightly as she reached the landing. The shadows around her grew darker, thicker, stretching toward Charlotte like grasping hands. "No!" Charlotte screamed, scrambling backward. "Stay away from me! Her foot caught on the edge of a rug, and she fell hard, the flashlight tumbling from her hand. It rolled across the floor, its beam spinning wildly and casting jagged shadows on the walls. In the flickering light, Charlotte could see that the woman wasn't alone. Other figures were emerging from the shadows, twisted, gaunt shapes with hollow eyes and two long limbs. They moved with unnatural fluidity, crawling out of the corners, spilling out from beneath furniture, all converging on her. Charlotte forced herself to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She grabbed the flashlight and bolted toward the kitchen, her only thought to escape. She flung open the door, only to find more figures waiting for her there, their empty eyes glinting in the dim light. Their heads cocked in unison, as if studying her. "Leave me alone!" she shouted, swinging the flashlight wildly. The figures didn't react. They only moved closer, their shapes rippling as though they weren't entirely solid. Charlotte stumbled back into the hallway, nearly colliding with a wall. The woman in the black dress had reached the bottom of the stairs now, her smile stretching wider, her hands slowly lifting as though beckoning Charlotte to come closer. Charlotte's chest heaved as she struggled to breathe. The house was alive with noise and movement, the whispers now an unrelenting roar. The walls pulsed, the floor shook, and the shadows closed in around her. She felt the presence of the house itself, its hunger, its malice, pressing against her mind. The ritual hadn't just failed, it had unleashed something far worse than she could have imagined. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the woman stepping forward, her smile now impossibly wide, her pale eyes glowing faintly. The shadows surged, swallowing the room, and Charlotte's scream was drowned out by the cacophony of the house's voices. Then, silence. The house stood still once more. The morning sun rose, its light spilling through the cracked windows. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. But the painting above the staircase was empty, and the faint scent of sulfur lingered in the air.